And in that reflection, stand someone very much like you. They lean in, just slightly, trying to understand what others might see, but hear. Beauty is not only about preference, it is quieter than that. Deeper. And sometimes heavier, because in this world, appearance carries meaning, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that ripple through daily life. A certain complexion might suggest comfort or hardship, a style of hair might hint at obedience or independence, even posture. The way one holds themselves can quietly speak, and so, standing before that imperfect mirror, this person is not just looking at themselves, they are reading a language, one they have learned slowly over years, a language of expectations. Outside, the day is calm, perhaps a narrow street stretches past the home, stone underfoot. Softened by time, the distant sound of footsteps. A passing cart, the murmur of quiet lives unfolding, and within those lives, everyone is being seen, not judged in obvious ways, but observed, measured. Gently. Constantly. There is no single rulebook. No written guide pinned to the wall, and yet everyone seems to understand, somehow. They just know. They know what is admired, what is acceptable, and what might draw unwanted attention, and so the mirror becomes something more than reflection. It becomes a moment of awareness, a pause between who you are and who the world expects you to be. The person in front of it adjusts something small, a strand of hair, a fold of fabric, a posture corrected ever so slightly, not out of vanity, but out of quiet understanding, because in this time, fitting in is often safer than standing out, and yet there is something deeply human here, because despite the differences in time, the differences in tools, the differences in ideals, that moment in front of the mirror feels familiar. And in that reflection, stand someone very much like you. They lean in, just slightly, trying to understand what others might see, but hear. Beauty is not only about preference, it is quieter than that. Deeper. And sometimes heavier, because in this world, appearance carries meaning, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that ripple through daily life. A certain complexion might suggest comfort or hardship, a style of hair might hint at obedience or independence, even posture. The way one holds themselves can quietly speak, and so, standing before that imperfect mirror, this person is not just looking at themselves, they are reading a language, one they have learned slowly over years, a language of expectations. Outside, the day is calm, perhaps a narrow street stretches past the home, stone underfoot. Softened by time, the distant sound of footsteps. A passing cart, the murmur of quiet lives unfolding, and within those lives, everyone is being seen, not judged in obvious ways, but observed, measured. Gently. Constantly. There is no single rulebook. No written guide pinned to the wall, and yet everyone seems to understand, somehow. They just know. They know what is admired, what is acceptable, and what might draw unwanted attention, and so the mirror becomes something more than reflection. It becomes a moment of awareness, a pause between who you are and who the world expects you to be. The person in front of it adjusts something small, a strand of hair, a fold of fabric, a posture corrected ever so slightly, not out of vanity, but out of quiet understanding, because in this time, fitting in is often safer than standing out, and yet there is something deeply human here, because despite the differences in time, the differences in tools, the differences in ideals, that moment in front of the mirror feels familiar. The quiet evaluation, the subtle comparison, the wondering of how others might perceive you, it is not so different after all. But as we move deeper into this world, we begin to notice something else: these standards. These expectations, they are not random, they are shaped by something larger, by class, by labor, by environment, by belief, and slowly, almost invisibly, they begin to form a picture of what beauty means, not just to an individual, but to an entire society. The reflection in the mirror fades slightly as the light shifts, and the person steps back, not entirely satisfied, not entirely dissatisfied, but aware that what they see is only part of the story, because beyond that quiet room, beyond that soft reflection, there is a world that defines beauty in ways both gentle and unexpected, and that world is where we're going next. The idea of beauty, in medieval times, was never just about appearance. It moved quietly beneath the surface, woven into daily life, into belief, into the way people understood the world around them. If you were to ask someone from that time what it meant to be beautiful, they might not answer immediately, not because they didn't know, but because the answer wasn't simple. Beauty was not only something you saw, it was something you recognized, a kind of silent agreement, shared by everyone, yet rarely spoken out loud, and it began with harmony, not perfection in the modern sense, but balance, a face that felt calm to look at, features that did not demand attention, but instead blended gently together. There was comfort in subtlety, nothing too bold, nothing too excessive, because standing out too much could feel unsettling. In a world shaped by structure and order, beauty followed similar rules. It reflected stability. A person whose appearance felt right was often seen as someone whose place in the world was also right, and this idea extended beyond the individual, because medieval life was deeply connected to belief, not just social rules, but something higher. Many people saw beauty as a reflection of divine order, a quiet sign that things were as they should be: soft features, balanced proportions, a calm and composed presence. These were not just preferences, they were signals, subtle hints of harmony between the physical world and something beyond it. And so, beauty carried a kind of quiet weight, not heavy, not overwhelming, but always there. It shaped first impressions, but also expectations. A person considered beautiful might be assumed to have certain qualities: gentleness, virtue, grace, not because of proof, but because appearance suggested it. And this is where things begin to shift slightly, because beauty was not entirely natural. It was influenced, guided, sometimes even controlled, not through strict rules written down, but through observation, watching others, learning what is admired, adjusting slowly over time. A young person growing up in this world would not be taught beauty directly. There were no lessons, no instructions, but they would see it in the way people reacted, in the small glances, the quiet approval, the subtle changes in tone, and from that, they would understand what to aim for, what to avoid, and perhaps most interesting of all, what not to become, because beauty in medieval times was as much about absence as it was about presence, avoiding what felt excessive, avoiding what felt out of place, avoiding anything that might disrupt the quiet balance. Even emotion was part of this. The expressions were often softened, controlled, a calm face, a composed posture. These too were considered part of beauty, not dramatic smiles, not exaggerated gestures, but something more restrained, more still, as if beauty itself preferred silence. And yet, within that silence, there was individuality, not loud, not obvious, but present, in the smallest details: a slightly different way of arranging hair, a subtle variation in clothing, a personal touch that stayed within the boundaries, but still felt unique, because even in a world of expectations, people remained human. They adapted, but they also expressed, just quietly. And as we begin to understand this, we start to see that beauty was not just about how someone looked, it was about how well they fit into a much larger picture, a picture shaped by belief, by society, by unspoken understanding. And standing in front of that faint mirror, the person from before was not simply asking, "Do I look good?" They were asking something deeper, "Do I belong in the way I appear?" The room feels still again. The outside world continues quietly, unaware of these small internal questions, but they matter because these ideas, these quiet definitions of beauty, will begin to shape everything that comes next, from skin to sunlight to the very fabric people choose to wear, and slowly, almost without noticing, we are moving closer to something more specific, more visible, more revealing, because in this world, one feature stood above the rest, not loudly, but unmistakably. In medieval times, before a single word was spoken, people were already understood, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to shape what came next. A passing glance, a brief moment of eye contact, the quiet observation of someone approaching, these were often all it took to form an impression, and once formed, that impression tended to stay, because in a world without introductions as we know them, without written profiles or clear identities, appearance became the first language, a silent introduction, spoken instantly, and remembered. Imagine walking along a narrow path, stone beneath your feet, the air still and slightly cool, in the distance. Someone approaches. You do not know their name, you do not know their story, and yet, as they come closer, you begin to understand something about them, the way they walk, steady or uncertain, the way they hold their posture, upright or slightly lowered, the condition of their clothing, worn or carefully maintained, each detail small on its own, but together forming a quiet message, not intentional, not always controlled, but visible. And in medieval life, these signals mattered, because society was structured, layered, deeply aware of position, not loudly discussed, but always present, and so people learned to read one another, not with suspicion, but with awareness. A certain kind of neatness might suggest discipline, a calm, composed expression might suggest reliability, while something slightly out of place, even something small, could create hesitation, not judgment in a harsh sense, but distance, a subtle pause, before trust, and often these impressions happened quickly, too quickly, perhaps, but in a world where daily life required constant interaction, markets, streets, shared spaces, there was little time for long explanations, so people relied on what they could see, and what they saw became meaning. There is something quiet, almost invisible, about this process. No one announces it, no one says, "I am judging you now." And yet, it happens, gently, constantly, like a current beneath still water. Even the smallest details could carry weight. A slightly lowered gaze might suggest modesty, but held too long, it might suggest uncertainty. A confident step might be admired, but if too pronounced, it might feel excessive, and so balance returns once again, that delicate space between too much and too little, where comfort exists, where acceptance feels easiest, and within that space, people adjusted themselves, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, over time. A shoulder straightened here, a movement softened there, tiny corrections, made almost unconsciously, because fitting into these silent expectations made life smoother, easier, safer. But this also meant something else. Something quieter, but more complex, because if appearance could create trust, it could also create misunderstanding. Someone might appear distant when they were simply tired. Someone might seem careless when they had little control over their circumstances, but the impression, once formed, rarely paused to ask why. And so, people carried these signals carefully, not out of fear, but out of understanding. They knew, even if no one explained it, that they were always being seen, and perhaps, more importantly, interpreted. The world around them remains calm. A soft breeze moves through a quiet street, fabric shifts gently, footsteps echo faintly against stone. Life continues, slow and steady, but beneath that calm, this silent exchange of signals continues, constant, unspoken, powerful in its own quiet way. And as we move forward, we begin to notice something even more specific, because among all these signals, one stood out more clearly than the rest, not because it was loud, but because it was immediately visible, something that could not be hidden easily, nor ignored, something shaped not only by choice, but by the world itself, the light, the air, the work people did each day. And slowly, we begin to see why one feature became so closely tied to the idea of beauty. There was something about the skin that people noticed first, not always consciously, not always intentionally, but almost immediately, before clothing, before posture, before even expression fully settled. The tone of the skin would already be seen, and in medieval times, this detail carried meaning, quiet but unmistakable, because pale skin was not just a natural feature, it was a signal, a soft, visible indication of a life lived away from certain kinds of labor, away from long hours under the open sky, away from the weight of constant physical work. It suggested not ease exactly, but distance, distance from the sun, distance from hardship that left its mark so clearly. And in a world where survival often depended on physical effort, this difference stood out, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that lingered, because pale skin was associated with a kind of stillness, a life lived more indoors, within stone walls, under shaded spaces, protected from the constant presence of sunlight, and that protection carried quiet significance. It hinted at stability, at a position where daily life did not require constant exposure, where time could be spent differently, more slowly, more deliberately, and so, over time, this association deepened. Pale skin began to represent something more than circumstance. It became desirable, not because it was inherently more beautiful, but because of what it suggested, because in medieval society, beauty and meaning were often intertwined. A feature was rarely just a feature, it was a message, and this particular message was clear enough to be understood without words, but like many things in this world, it was not absolute. Because not everyone could choose this, most people lived their lives outdoors, working fields, walking long distances, existing under the open sky. The sun was not something to avoid, it was simply part of life, and so their skin carried that story, a deeper tone, a texture shaped by wind and light, subtle marks left behind by time spent outside, not careless, not unrefined, but different, and yet the quiet preference remained, not enforced, not spoken as a rule, but present in small reactions, in the way people were perceived, in the subtle differences in how they were treated, and slowly people became aware of it, not all at once, but gradually they noticed which appearances drew softer attention, which ones seemed to settle more easily into acceptance, and from that awareness came adjustment, careful, quiet, almost unspoken. Some sought shade when they could, lingering just a little longer indoors, walking along the edge of sunlight rather than through it, not as a strict effort, but as a gentle inclination, because even small changes felt meaningful. There were no dramatic transformations, no instant results, only subtle shifts. Over time, a face that remained slightly lighter, a complexion that avoided deep exposure. These became quiet achievements, not announced, not displayed, but understood. And still, there was a kind of balance, because skin alone was not enough. It had to exist alongside everything else, the calm expression, the composed posture, the quiet harmony we've already seen. Without those, even the most desired features could feel incomplete, and so, once again, beauty returns to balance. To subtlety, to the space where nothing feels excessive, the light changes slowly, perhaps the sun lowers just slightly, casting softer tones across the world, and in that gentle shift, we begin to understand something deeper, because this preference, this quiet value placed on pale skin, was not only about appearance, it was about contrast, about the difference between lives, between those who could remain within shade and those who could not. And this contrast would shape many other aspects of beauty: hair, clothing, movement, even the way people carried themselves would begin to reflect this divide. The world remains calm, still, but the meaning beneath it is becoming clearer, because now, we are no longer just looking at individuals, we are beginning to see the structure around them, and just beyond this, there is something even more constant, something that cannot be avoided or softened entirely, the source of that contrast itself, the light above, the warmth that touches everything equally, yet changes each life differently. The sunlight, in medieval times, was not just light, it was presence, constant, unavoidable, touching everything equally, and yet, affecting each life differently. It arrived softly in the morning, spreading across rooftops, slipping through narrow streets, resting gently on stone and wood. By midday, it grew stronger, warmer, more direct, lingering on open fields, on roads, on those who spent their days beneath it, and then, by evening, it softened again, fading slowly, leaving behind long shadows, and a quiet sense of stillness. But within this daily rhythm, there was something else, something less visible, yet deeply understood, because sunlight revealed differences. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time, the kind of life a person lived could often be seen in how the sun had touched them. Those who worked outdoors felt its presence fully, day after day, season after season. The light would leave its trace, a gradual deepening of tone, a texture shaped by exposure, small changes that spoke of time spent under open skies, not as a mark of imperfection, but as a quiet record of labor, of effort, of endurance. And then there were those whose lives unfolded differently, who spent more time indoors, within shaded courtyards, inside stone walls that softened the light. For them, the sun was something seen, but not always felt directly. It existed beyond windows, at the edges of their world, but rarely upon their skin, and so, over time, a difference emerged, subtle, but unmistakable, not only in appearance, but in what that appearance suggested, because in medieval society, daily life was closely tied to role. And role was closely tied to class, not as a rigid statement spoken aloud, but as a structure. Quietly lived, those who labored outdoors often belonged to the working classes, their time shaped by necessity, their days defined by tasks that could not be avoided, while those with greater means lived in spaces that allowed distance from such demands, not entirely free from responsibility, but different in nature, more controlled, more sheltered. And so, sunlight became something more than environment. It became an indicator, a natural marker, that revealed something about a person's place in the world, not intentionally, not chosen, but visible. And because of this, it began to influence perception. Pale skin, as we've seen, was associated with distance from labor, and distance from labor suggested a different kind of life, one with more stability, more protection from the elements, more separation from the unpredictability of outdoor work. And slowly, this association grew stronger, not as a rule, but as a pattern, observed, understood, accepted. But here, something subtle happens, because this connection between sunlight and social class was not only about admiration, it was also about awareness. People understood, even if they never spoke it directly, that these differences existed, that not everyone could step into the shade or choose how much of the sun they experienced. And so, there was a quiet realism to it, a recognition that beauty was not always within reach, not entirely, and yet, small effort still appeared, subtle choices, made within the limits of daily life. A hat worn just slightly lower, a path chosen along the edge of a building, a moment taken to rest in shade when possible, not to escape the sun entirely, but to soften its effect, because even the smallest difference could be felt and understood. But despite all of this, there was no loud separation, no dramatic divide in daily interaction. People shared spaces, markets, streets, moments of passing connection. And within those moments, these differences existed quietly. Seen, but not always acknowledged, felt, but rarely discussed, the world itself remains calm. A soft breeze moves through open air, light shifts gently across the ground, figures continue their slow, steady routines. But now, we begin to see something more clearly, because beauty, in this world, is not separate from life, it is shaped by it, by the work people do, by the places they inhabit, by the light that touches them each day. And as we continue forward, we move from skin to something equally visible, but far more expressive, something that could be shaped more freely, yet still carried meaning, something that framed the face and quietly completed the image, care. If the skin revealed a life, then the hair revealed a choice, not always a bold one, not always a dramatic one, but a quiet expression of identity within limits. In medieval times, hair was never just hair, it framed the face, softened features, and carried meaning in ways that were often subtle, but deeply understood. The way it fell, the way it was arranged, even the way it was hidden, all of it mattered. But unlike modern times, where change can be quick and intentional, hair in this world moved slowly. It grew with time, changed with seasons, and was shaped more by care than transformation. There were no sudden shifts, no dramatic reinventions, only gradual adjustments, made patiently. And within those adjustments, style began to form, simple, but intentional. For many, hair was kept long, not for decoration alone, but because cutting it too short could feel unusual, even slightly out of place. Length carried a quiet sense of continuity, a connection to tradition, to what had always been done. And yet, it was not left entirely free. Hair was often arranged, gently controlled, guided into shapes that felt appropriate. Loose strands were softened, tied back, or subtly secured, not tightly, not rigidly, but enough to suggest care, because untamed hair could feel unpredictable, and unpredictability rarely aligned with the calm balance that defined beauty in this time. Color, too, held quiet significance, not in the bold, expressive sense we might imagine today, but in a softer, more observational way. Lighter tones often caught the light more easily. They reflected softness, a certain brightness that felt gentle rather than striking. Darker tones absorbed the light instead, creating depth, a sense of quiet presence, something steady and grounded. Neither was absolute in meaning, neither guaranteed admiration, but both were noticed, and over time, people became aware of these differences, not to change them completely, but to work with them, to present what they already had, in a way that felt harmonious. A braid, carefully woven, not elaborate, but neat, a parting, slightly adjusted, to frame the face more evenly, a covering, placed just enough, to guide what was seen, and what remained hidden, because just like skin, hair existed within expectation, not strict rules, but shared understanding. And within that understanding, there were boundaries. Some styles felt appropriate, others felt slightly too noticeable, not forbidden, but quietly discouraged. And so, once again, balance returned, the same quiet principle, appearing in different forms, nothing too bold, nothing too careless, only what fit, what settled easily, what did not disturb the calm surface of appearance. But there is something else here, something more human, because even within these boundaries, people found ways to express themselves, not loudly, not in ways that demanded attention, but in details. The way a braid was tied, slightly looser, or more precise, the way a strand was allowed to fall, or gently tucked away, small choices that carried personality, not enough to disrupt expectation, but enough to feel individual, and perhaps that was where true expression lived, not in breaking the rules, but in moving gently within them. The room is quiet again, the light soft, falling gently across a figure adjusting their hair, no urgency, no pressure, only a quiet moment of preparation, because once they step outside, they will be seen, not completely, not deeply, but enough, and their hair, like everything else, will become part of that silent introduction. Part of the message, spoken without words, and yet, as we move forward, we begin to notice something unexpected, because while hair could express identity, it was also often hidden, not entirely, but carefully, guided beneath fabric, softly covered, not removed from view, but controlled, and in that act of covering, there was meaning, not about beauty alone, but about something deeper, something tied to modesty, to expectation, to the way people believed appearance should be presented, and that is where we're going next. There comes a moment, after the hair is arranged, after the small adjustments are made, when it begins to disappear, not completely, not abruptly, but gradually, softly, as fabric is placed over it. In medieval times, covering the hair was not unusual. In fact, it was expected, not always in the same way, not for everyone, but often enough that its absence could feel noticeable. At first, this might seem like a contradiction. If hair carried meaning, if it framed the face, if it offered quiet expression, why cover it? The answer is not simple, because covering the hair was not about hiding beauty, it was about guiding it, softening it, containing it, placing it within a boundary that felt appropriate. In many parts of medieval society, appearance was closely tied to modesty, not in a strict or forceful way, but in a quiet understanding of how one should present themselves, especially in public, and hair, with its movement, its softness, its ability to draw attention, was something that could feel too expressive when left entirely uncovered, so it was adjusted. Not removed, not ignored, but gently controlled, a cloth, a veil, a simple covering, placed with care, not tightly, not harshly, just enough to change the way it was seen, and in doing so, it changed the entire impression. The face became the focus, the expression more central, the overall appearance more composed. There is something quiet about this act, something slow, a moment of transition between private and public, because before the covering, there is a brief space where the hair is fully visible, untouched by fabric, free in its natural form, and then, with a single motion, it becomes something else, not less, just different, more contained, more aligned with expectation. And this expectation was not always spoken, no one needed to explain it, it was simply understood, seen in others, repeated over time, absorbed without instruction. A young person, watching those around them, would notice the way coverings were placed, the way they framed the face, the quiet consistency of it, and slowly, they would begin to do the same, not because they were told, but because it felt right, because it fit, and within this, there were subtle variations. Not everyone covered their hair in the same way. Some allowed small strands to remain visible, softening the edge of the fabric. Others kept everything tucked neatly away, creating a more uniform appearance. Neither approach was extreme, both stayed within the same quiet boundaries, because once again, balance remained, always present, always guiding, but beyond modesty. There was something deeper, something less visible, but just as important, because covering the hair also created a sense of separation, a distinction between what was shown and what was kept private, not hidden out of fear, but preserved, a part of the self that did not need to be fully visible, to be understood, and in this way, appearance became layered. What people saw was only part of the story, and perhaps that made it more meaningful, because it invited interpretation, a glimpse, rather than a full view, a suggestion. Rather than a statement, the world outside remains quiet. Soft light touches the edges of buildings, a gentle breeze moves through narrow streets. And figures pass one another, calm, composed, their appearances carefully presented. Hair, now partially hidden, becomes part of a larger image, one that speaks, but never too loudly. And as we continue forward, we begin to notice something else, because once the hair is covered, once the face is framed, attention begins to shift to something broader, more visible, something that moves with the body, that reflects both identity and position. Clothing. Once the hair was covered, once the face was framed, the eye naturally moved outward, to the body, to the shape of movement, to the fabric that surrounded it all. Clothing, in medieval times, was never just clothing, it was presence, the way it fell, the way it shifted with each step, the way it caught the light, or softened into shadow. All of it spoke, quietly, but clearly enough to be understood. At first glance, it might seem simple: loose garments, natural fabrics, layers that followed the body without forcing it, nothing sharp, nothing overly structured, but within that simplicity, there was detail, subtle, but intentional, because clothing, like everything else we've seen, existed within balance. Too plain, and it might feel unfinished; too elaborate, and it might feel excessive. So most people lived somewhere in between, a careful middle ground, where appearance felt complete, but not overwhelming. The materials themselves told part of the story. Rougher fabrics, with visible texture, often carried the feeling of daily use. They moved differently, held their shape in a quieter way, absorbed light rather than reflecting it, while softer materials flowed more easily, responded gently to movement, caught light in subtle folds, not dramatically, but enough to create a difference. And this difference was noticed, not loudly, not in open comparison, but in the same quiet way everything else was observed, because clothing did not exist on its own. It worked with the body, with posture, with movement, with the rhythm of daily life. A person standing still, their clothing resting softly around them, might appear calm, composed, balanced. The same person walking, fabric shifting slightly with each step, might reveal something more: confidence, carefulness, or even hesitation. And so, clothing became part of expression, not through bold design, but through motion, through how it lived with the body. There is something slow about this, something almost meditative. Watching fabric move, catch light, settle again, it mirrors the pace of life itself. Nothing rushed, nothing abrupt, only steady, continuous presence. And yet, within this calm, there was also distinction, because just as sunlight revealed differences in life, so too did clothing. Not always through decoration, but through quality, through condition. A well-kept garment, clean, carefully arranged, suggested attention, not wealth necessarily, but care, while something worn, slightly uneven, carrying the marks of long use, told a different story, not negative, not lesser, just shaped by different circumstances. And again, people noticed, without speaking, without announcing it. They understood, because clothing, like skin, like hair, like posture, was part of the same quiet language, a language of signals, of impressions formed before words. And within this language, there was consistency. Certain shapes, certain layers, certain ways of wearing fabric became familiar, expected, not enforced, but repeated often enough that they felt natural. And so, most people followed them, not exactly, not perfectly, but closely enough to remain within that space of comfort, that space where nothing feels out of place. But still, within all of this, there was room for something small, something personal, a slight adjustment in how fabric was tied, a fold placed just a little differently, a choice in how layers were arranged, tiny decisions, almost invisible, yet meaningful, because even in a world shaped by expectation, people found ways to exist as themselves, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, through Cleanliness, in medieval times, was not a simple idea. It was not only about appearance, and not always about comfort. It was perception, how someone was seen, how they were understood, how their presence felt to others, and this perception was shaped by many things. The world itself was different. Water was not always easy to access in abundance, bathing was not a daily expectation for everyone, and life, for most people, was physically demanding, so cleanliness did not follow modern rhythm, it followed circumstance. Some people had access to more regular washing, often those with greater stability in life, those whose routines allowed time and resources for care. Others lived with what was available, not neglectfully, but practically, because daily survival often came first, and yet, despite these differences, cleanliness still carried meaning, not always spoken, but quietly understood, because people notice, not in a harsh way, but in a subtle way, that shapes first impressions. A fresh, simple appearance often created a sense of calm, order, care, attention, while a more worn appearance did not necessarily suggest anything negative, but could feel different in social perception, not lesser. Just further from refinement associated with comfort, and so cleanliness became part of appearance, not separate from it. Hair, clothing, skin, all came together in forming that impression, but unlike beauty standards we've seen before, cleanliness was not purely aesthetic, it was also practical, linked to work, to environment, to access, and because of that, it was deeply human, not idealized, not perfected, just lived. There is something quiet about this reality. No strict lines, no absolute states, only variation. Some days more care was possible, other days less, and people adjusted naturally, not in resistance, but in rhythm with life, and within this rhythm, there was understanding, because everyone knew that appearance could change depending on circumstances. A person seen in one moment might not reflect their usual state, and so judgment was often softer than we might imagine, not always, but often enough to create space, space for reality, space for imperfection, but still. Perception remained important, because humans are observers, they notice details, even when they do not speak of them. The well-kept appearance might suggest stability, while a more unrefined one might suggest hardship, not as a rule, but as an instinctive reading, and over time, people learn to navigate this, to present themselves in ways that felt appropriate for the moment, not to deceive, but to communicate, because appearance was communication, and cleanliness was part of that language. There is no dramatic shift here, no sudden change, only slow awareness of how small details shape how one is seen, and how being seen shapes interaction. The world remains steady, a quiet village path, soft light touching stone, a figure walking slowly, composed, nothing exaggerated, only presence, and within that presence, a careful sense of care, not perfection, but intention. And as we move forward, we begin to see another shift, because while cleanliness speaks through perception, there is also another layer, something more subtle still, something not always chosen, but often experienced, the difference between what is natural and what is presented, between reality and refinement. In medieval times, the line between natural appearance and altered appearance was never fully sharp. It existed, but softly, like a faint boundary, visible only when you looked closely. Most beauty was expected to feel natural, not forced, not exaggerated, not overly constructed, but that did not mean people did nothing to influence how they appeared. They did, quietly, carefully, within what was available to them. Because even in a world shaped by simplicity, there was still awareness of how certain details could be gently adjusted, not to create something entirely new, but to guide what already existed, to refine it, in small ways. The idea of artificial beauty did not mean something extreme or obvious. It meant enhancement, subtle correction, soft improvement, a quiet shaping of what nature already provided. For example, skin might be cared for with natural mixtures, not to transform it completely, but to soften its appearance. Hair might be arranged more carefully on certain days, not to change its nature, but to present it with intention. Even clothing could influence perception by drawing attention in certain directions, or softening others, but none of this was meant to be visible as effort. That was important, because effort that looked too obvious could feel unnatural, and unnatural was rarely aligned with ideal beauty. So everything had to remain balanced. There is something quiet about this intention, a desire not to erase nature, but to work alongside it, to bring out what was already there, without overwhelming it. And this is where perception becomes important again, because what looked natural was not always purely untouched, and what was refined was not always fully artificial. The two often blended together in ways that were not immediately visible: a slight smoothing of appearance, a careful arrangement of hair, a choice of clothing that framed the body gently. These were not seen as deception, they were seen as care, attention, respect for presentation. But still, there was awareness of balance, because going too far was not admired. Excess, even in enhancement, could disrupt harmony, and harmony remained central to beauty, so people learned restraint, to adjust, but not transform, to enhance, but not exaggerate, and within that restraint, there was creativity, not loud creativity, but quiet expression, a way of working within limits, while still expressing individuality. One person might choose softer tones in clothing, another might prefer slightly more structured arrangements. Neither was considered incorrect, as long as it remained within the shared understanding of what felt appropriate. And so, natural and artificial were not enemies, they were layers, working together, blending into one another, forming a single impression, one that felt complete, but never overwhelming. There is also something deeply human here, because even without modern tools, without fast transformation, people still cared about how they were seen. They still adjusted, they still refined, they still observed others and learned, not in pursuit of perfection, but in pursuit of belonging, and that belonging was shaped by subtle detail, not dramatic change, just enough adjustment to feel aligned with expectation. The world remained soft and steady, a figure standing near a window, light falling gently across their face, hands resting calmly as they prepare themselves for the day. Nothing rushed, nothing excessive, only quiet intention. And as we move forward, we begin to see something even more atmospheric, because beyond appearance, beyond shaping and refining, there were also elements that lingered in the air itself, invisible, yet constantly present: fragrance. In medieval times, beauty was rarely the result of a single moment. It was not sudden, not dramatic, not created all at once. Instead, it was built slowly, through repetition, through small, quiet actions, woven into everyday life. These were not rituals in the modern sense, not structured routines with clear steps. They were habits, soft, almost invisible habits, that became part of living itself. A person might begin the day, not by transforming their appearance, but by adjusting it. A strand of hair gently moved back into place, a fold of clothing smoothed down, a quiet glance at their reflection in a dull surface. Nothing excessive, nothing hurried, just awareness. Awareness of how they appeared before stepping into the world, because appearance was not something left entirely to chance. It was shaped in small ways, through attention, and over time, these small adjustments became familiar, not forced, not carefully planned, but natural, like remembering to straighten posture while walking, or pausing briefly before entering a shared space. These actions were not always about beauty alone, they were about readiness, about presenting oneself in a way that felt appropriate for interaction. There is a quiet rhythm to it, a soft repetition of care that exists without being spoken. For many, this care began at home, in simple surroundings, where light entered gently through small windows, and daily life moved at a slower pace. Here, appearance was checked in passing, not with intense scrutiny, but with gentle awareness, a moment of stillness, before stepping outside, and once outside, these subtle practices continued, not openly, not visibly, but internally. People adjusted themselves constantly, in response to environment, the wind, the light, the presence of others, all influenced how they carried themselves, not in a dramatic way, but in a continuous flow. There were also shared influences. People observed others, not to copy directly, but to understand what felt familiar, what seemed balanced, what felt at ease within the world around them, and through this quiet observation, small practices spread, not as rules, but as patterns. Ways of tying hair more neatly, ways of arranging fabric so it fell naturally, ways of standing that felt composed without stiffness, each one subtle on its own, but together, they shaped perception, because beauty, in this time, was not separated from behavior. It was part of how one existed. Even walking carried its own subtle awareness, not rigid, not controlled, but mindful, a steady pace, a calm presence, a sense of not disturbing the space around them, and within this, there was comfort, because when appearance felt aligned, movement felt easier, less thought was needed, less adjustment required, it became part of identity, without needing constant attention. Still, there was individuality. Even within shared habits, no two people carried themselves exactly the same. One might prefer slightly more order in appearance, another might allow a softer looseness. These differences were small, but meaningful, because they reflected personality within expectation, and that balance was important. Too much deviation could feel unfamiliar, too little could feel indistinct, so people learned, not through instruction, but through living, through seeing, through adjusting, through repeating, and slowly. These subtle practices became invisible, so natural, that they were no longer noticed as practices at all, only as part of being. The world remains quiet, a figure pauses briefly before a doorway, adjusts their clothing almost instinctively, then steps forward into the light, no hesitation, no awareness of performance, just continuity, and as we move forward, we begin to notice something more sensory, because appearance was not only visual, it extended into the air, into atmosphere, into what people carried with them, without ever seeing it. Scent. In medieval times, scent was never just a background detail, it was presence, soft and invisible, yet constantly surrounding people as they moved through the world. Before modern fragrances, there were no strong artificial perfumes, in the way we might imagine today. Instead, there were natural scents, gentle, earthy, and deeply connected to daily life, herbs, flowers, dried plants, simple oils extracted through careful, slow methods. These were used not to overwhelm the senses, but to soften them, to bring a sense of freshness into spaces shaped by stone, wood, and open air. In homes, a small bundle of herbs might hang near a window, catching breeze and light at the same time, slowly releasing a faint, calming aroma, not strong, not sharp, just present. Outside, the world carried its own scents, earth after rain, wood warmed by sun, fields in quiet bloom during certain seasons. Even the air itself changed depending on place and time, and people became part of this environment, not separate from it. Their clothing, their movement, their daily routines, all absorbed the world around them. So scent was not something added on top of life, it was part of it, but still, there was awareness of it, because like appearance, scent influenced perception, not in a dramatic way, but gently. A fresh and simple scent often suggested care, clean surroundings, calm living, attention to detail, while stronger natural odors, associated with labor or environment, were simply part of life itself, not judged harshly, but recognized, and within this understanding, people adapted, not by erasing natural scent, but by softening it. Herbs placed in living spaces, washed linens dried in open air, small oils used sparingly on the skin, each action subtle, each one part of a quiet effort to maintain balance, because again, Nothing was meant to dominate. Not appearance, not scent, not presence, only harmony. There is something very gentle about this idea, a world where scent is not used to announce oneself loudly, but to exist softly within space, to be noticed only when close enough, and even then, not overwhelming, just present. This subtlety shaped how people experienced each other. When two people passed by, there might be a faint trace of herbs, of fabric warmed by sun, of natural oils used in simple care, not perfume as we think of it today, but something closer to atmosphere, a lingering impression that fades quickly, but is remembered quietly, and because of this, scent became part of memory, not consciously always, but instinctively. A place, a moment, a person could sometimes be recalled, not by sight alone, but by the feeling of air around them. Still, this was never emphasized loudly. It remained subtle. Like everything else in this world of balance, it existed without needing attention. Even care for scent was understated. No excess, no layering of strong fragrances, only light touches, meant to align with natural surroundings. And so life continued, in a kind of sensory softness, where nothing dominated fully, and everything blended gently together. The world remains calm again. A small room with open windows, herbs hanging quietly in the breeze, light moving slowly across stone walls. A figure stands still for a moment, before stepping outside. They carry nothing visible, yet they are part of everything around them, and as we move forward, we begin to see something more refined, because once scent and appearance are understood, attention shifts again, toward restraint, toward simplicity itself, toward the idea that sometimes, less was not absence, but intention. Simplicity, in medieval times, was not emptiness, it was intention, a careful removal of anything unnecessary, until only what felt balance remained, in a world filled with texture, fabric, stone, wood, light, shadow. Simplicity was not lack of detail, it was control over it. People did not always aim to stand out. More often, they aimed to feel aligned with their surroundings, to exist without disrupting the quiet rhythm of daily life, and in this way, simplicity became a kind of beauty, not loud, not decorative, not demanding attention, but steady and calm. There was something deeply grounding about it, a face without excessive adornment, a garment without unnecessary layers. A space arranged with only what was needed. All of it created a sense of ease, as if the world itself could breathe more slowly, and this idea extended beyond appearance. It shaped behavior, it shaped movement, it shaped how people interacted with space, because too much was rarely admired, too many details, too many adjustments, too many visible efforts, could disrupt harmony, and harmony was central to perception of beauty. So people learned to reduce, not in a harsh way, not through restriction, but through awareness. They noticed what felt unnecessary, and slowly let it fall away. A decoration not needed, a gesture not required, a choice not aligned with context. Each one softened or removed, until what remained felt natural. But simplicity was not the same for everyone. For some, it was shaped by necessity, limited access to materials, limited time, limited resources, naturally created a simpler appearance. For others, it was a choice, a way of presenting themselves, as composed, stable, uncomplicated, and both were understood within their own context. There is something quiet about this duality, because simplicity does not erase difference, it reframes it. A plain appearance is not always absence of care, and a detailed one is not always excess. It depends on intention and perception, and in medieval times, intention was often read through restraint, not through abundance. So, simplicity became a kind of language, a way of saying, without saying, I am composed, I am steady, I am within balance. And others recognized this language without needing explanation. There was also comfort in it, because simplicity reduces uncertainty. When nothing feels exaggerated, nothing feels unpredictable, everything sits within a calm range. that the mind can easily understand, and that understanding creates ease in interaction. But simplicity was never static, it existed in variation. What felt simple in one place might feel slightly different in another. A garment considered modest in one region might appear more detailed elsewhere. So simplicity was not absolute, it was relational, shaped by environment, culture, and shared expectation, and this made it flexible, soft rather than rigid. Even within that flexibility, people remained aware of balance. Too little presence could feel unfinished, too much could feel heavy, so the middle space remained important, that quiet middle space, where everything feels settled, not empty, not crowded, just enough, and within that space, people could exist without distraction. There is a stillness in this idea, a world where beauty is not constructed through accumulation, but through careful removal, where the absence of excess becomes its own form of presence. The light in a simple room falls evenly across stone walls. A figure sits quietly, no unnecessary movement, no unnecessary detail, only calm presence, and in that calm, there is clarity, because simplicity does not remove meaning, it refines it, and as we move forward, we begin to see contrast again, because simplicity does not erase difference between people, it often highlights it, quietly, without intention, but clearly enough to notice, and that brings us to how beauty varied between those different lives, between those who had more and those who had less, not in judgment, but in structure. In medieval times, people often shared the same streets, the same air, the same rhythms of daily life, and yet, their lives were not the same. This difference was not always spoken, but it was understood, and sometimes it could be seen, not directly, not dramatically, but through subtle details that reveal different kinds of living. Clothing, for example, might look similar at a glance, but upon closer observation, small differences appeared: the way fabric fell, the quality of stitching, the softness or roughness of material. All of it hinted at access, not wealth in a loud sense, but stability, because those with more resources could afford refinement. Not excess, but consistency, clothing that lasted longer, that held shape more easily, that felt smoother in movement, while others wore what was practical, durable, simple, adapted to daily demands. Neither was wrong, but they were different, and people noticed, not through judgment alone, but through familiarity, because over time, the eye learns patterns, it learns what belongs where, what feels familiar in certain spaces, what feels slightly out of place in others. And so, without needing explanation, class differences became visible, not loudly marked, but quietly present, in posture as well. Those who lived with fewer physical demands often moved with a certain ease. Not superiority, but softness in motion, less strain visible in daily gesture, while those engaged in continuous labor carried a different rhythm. Steadier, more grounded, shaped by repetition of effort, again, not better or worse, just different, and in medieval society, these differences were normal, not questioned in modern ways, they simply existed as part of structure. But what is interesting is how beauty interacted with this structure, because beauty standards were not separate from class, they were influenced by it. A softer appearance, often associated with those who spent more time indoors, away from physical exposure, became linked with ideals of refinement, while more weathered appearances carried association with labor and environment, not negatively defined, but socially recognized, and so perception formed quietly. Without needing instruction, there was also space between these categories. Not every detail fit neatly into one side. People moved between environments, between roles, between moments of different conditions, and so appearance could shift, depending on circumstance. A person seen in one context might appear differently in another, which made observation more nuanced, less absolute, and within this nuance, there was humanity. Because no single appearance could fully define a person, But society still used visual cues to make sense of one another, as people naturally do. There is a calmness to this realization, not tension, but awareness, that appearance is always read within context, and context is shaped by life. The streets remain quiet, a small group passes through a village square, each person carrying subtle signs of their daily environment. Nothing exaggerated, nothing loud, only gentle differences that exist without announcement, and as we continue forward, we begin to see how these differences intersect with something more personal, because beauty was not only about society. It was also tied to expectations of connection, of relationships, of how people were seen in the context of marriage and family. In medieval times, beauty was never just a personal matter, it often existed within a wider expectation, one that quietly shaped life paths long before decisions were made, and one of the clearest places this appeared was in marriage, not as a dramatic event, but as a gradual alignment between families, circumstances, and perception, because marriage was not only about emotion, it was also about stability, connection, and social balance, and within that structure, appearance naturally played a role, not as the only factor, but as one of the first things noticed when people met or were observed within a community. Beauty often influenced first impressions, soft features, calm presence, well-kept appearance. These were quietly associated with positive assumptions, not guarantees, but impressions, and impressions mattered, because before deeper understanding developed, there was only what could be seen. Families, too, observed carefully, not in a harsh or calculating way, but with awareness. They noticed how a person carried themselves, how they presented in daily life, how they were perceived within their surroundings. Because marriage was also about integration, two lives becoming connected within a shared structure, and appearance became part of that consideration, a composed look, a balanced presence, a sense of care in self-presentation. These could suggest readiness for social harmony, not perfection, but suitability. But it is important to understand, beauty alone was never the foundation. It worked alongside other qualities, behavior, reputation, family standing, daily conduct. All of these formed a larger picture. Still, beauty held influence, quiet influence, because in social gatherings, or chance encounters within villages, appearance created first impressions that were difficult to ignore. A calm, gentle appearance might create a sense of ease in others, while a more rough or unrefined presentation might simply be interpreted differently, not negatively defined, but understood within context of lifestyle. And so, people became aware of how they were seen, not obsessively, but naturally. They understood that appearance could affect how interactions began. And this awareness shaped behavior, small adjustments in clothing, in posture, in care of self-presentation, not to change identity, but to align with expectation. But beyond families and social structure, there was also personal experience, because individuals themselves lived within these expectations. A young person might grow up observing how others were regarded, seeing which appearances seemed to draw softer attention, which seemed to be spoken of differently, and from this, they learned, not through instruction, but through observation, and this learning was gradual. Like everything else in this world, over time, they would begin to understand how beauty and perception were connected within their environment. But even then, there was no single rule, because attraction was still human, still subtle, still varied, still influenced by countless small factors. Beyond appearance alone, a gentle expression, a calm voice, a composed presence could matter just as much as physical features, and often more. So beauty in marriage expectations was never a fixed idea. It was part of a larger harmony between appearance, behavior, and belonging. The world remains quiet again, a small gathering in a village courtyard, people speaking softly, faces calm in the fading light of afternoon. Nothing urgent, only gentle interaction within a structured world. And as we move forward, we begin to see something more internal. Because beneath all expectations, there was pressure, not loud pressure, but steady, a quiet awareness of how one should appear, and how that appearance might shape the future. In medieval times, expectations were not always spoken aloud. There were no constant reminders, no written lists, no direct instructions given each day, and yet, they were there, felt, rather than heard, a quiet presence that followed people through daily life, because by now, appearance had already been shaped by many things, by balance, by simplicity, by class, by social signals, and slowly these ideas settled into something deeper, an awareness, not forced, not overwhelming, but steady, a sense that one should appear in a certain way, not exactly the same as others, but close enough to feel aligned. This awareness did not arrive all at once, it formed gradually. Through observation, through experience, through small moments that repeated over time, a glance held slightly longer, a subtle change in tone during conversation, a quiet difference in how someone was treated, each one small, but together, they created understanding, and that understanding became pressure, not loud pressure, not something that demanded immediate action, but something that stayed in the background, guiding behavior, shaping decisions, influencing how people prepared themselves before stepping into the world. A person standing alone, adjusting their clothing slightly, might not think of it as pressure. It would feel natural, instinctive, but that instinct came from somewhere, from everything they had seen, everything they had learned without being taught, and because of this, the pressure rarely felt external, it felt internal, as if it belonged to them, as if it was simply how things should be. There is something quiet about this. Because when expectations become internal, they no longer need to be enforced, they live within behavior itself, and so people carried themselves with awareness, not anxiety, not fear, but careful attention, a desire to remain within that space where appearance felt appropriate, where nothing seemed out of place, where interaction flowed smoothly. But within this, there was also variation. Some people felt this awareness more strongly, others moved through it more lightly, not ignoring it, but not shaped by it as deeply, and this created subtle differences in how individuals expressed themselves. One person might adjust every small detail, seeking alignment with expectation. Another might allow more natural variation, accepting slight differences in appearance. Both existed within the same world, but experienced it differently, and this is where the pressure becomes more complex, because it was not only about fitting in. It was also about identity, about how much of oneself to present, and how much to adapt, not as a dramatic conflict, but as a quiet balance, a continuous adjustment between personal comfort and social understanding, and within that balance, people found their place, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to move through daily life with ease. The world outside remains calm, a soft breeze moves through narrow streets, light shifts gently across stone surfaces, and figures continue their routines. Nothing appears tense, nothing seems forced, but beneath that calm, there is awareness, always present, shaping small actions, guiding quiet decisions, in ways that are almost invisible, and perhaps, that is what makes it powerful. Because it does not need to be seen, it only needs to be felt, and as we move forward, we begin to explore something more specific again, because all of this awareness, all of this subtle pressure, was built around an idea, an image, a sense of what was considered attractive, not universally, not absolutely, but clearly enough to guide perception. By now, after all the small observations, the quiet adjustments, the gentle expectations, a picture begins to form, not sharply, not perfectly, but softly, like something seen through a faint reflection, the idea of what was considered attractive in medieval times. This idea was never written clearly, there was no single definition, no exact description that everyone followed, and yet, people understood it. Because it existed in patterns, in repetition, in the way certain Appearances were noticed more easily, remembered more often, spoken of more gently. Attraction was not about standing out suddenly, it was about feeling right, familiar, balanced, at ease within the world around it. A face that did not demand attention, but held it quietly, soft features, without sharp extremes, a sense of calm in expression, not overly animated, not entirely still, but somewhere in between, eyes that seemed steady, a gaze that did not linger too long, yet did not withdraw too quickly. There was something peaceful about it, something that made interaction feel easier, because attractiveness was closely tied to comfort. Not intensity, a person who felt easy to look at, easy to be around, often aligned with this idea. And once again, balance appears, nothing too strong, nothing too faint, just enough presence to feel complete. Skin, as we've seen, played its part, a softer tone, often associated with refinement, but not alone, because without harmony in other features, it would not be enough. Hair framed the face quietly, not overly styled, not completely loose, but arranged in a way that supported the overall balance. Clothing fell naturally, moving with the body, rather than shaping it forcefully, and posture held everything together, calm, composed, unforced. Not rigid, not overly relaxed, but steady. There is something deeply consistent here. Attractiveness was not about change, it was about alignment, all elements working together, without conflict, without one detail drawing too much attention, because when one part becomes too strong, the balance shifts, and balance was everything. Even emotion played a role, a gentle expression, a slight softness in the face. These created connection, while exaggerated emotion could feel unsettling, so even feeling was quietly guided, not suppressed, but softened. And yet, within all of this, there was variation, because attraction is never identical. From one person to another, different environments, different experiences, different lives, all shape perception in small ways. So while a general image existed, it was not rigid. It allowed space for individuality, space for subtle difference, but always within that shared understanding of balance and harmony. The world remains calm, a figure stands in soft light, their appearance neither striking nor plain, but quietly complete. Nothing calls for attention, and yet nothing feels missing, and perhaps that is what defined attractiveness most clearly, not the presence of something extraordinary, but the absence of imbalance, a sense that everything is exactly where it should be. And as we move forward, we begin to notice something unexpected, because not all beauty ideals fit perfectly within this calm structure. Some were slightly unusual, not disruptive, but different enough to stand out quietly, and those differences tell their own story. Up until now, beauty in medieval times has felt predictable, balanced, soft, quietly aligned with harmony, and for the most part, that is true, but like any human idea, it was never entirely uniform. There were moments, small, almost hidden moments, where beauty shifted slightly, not enough to disrupt everything, but enough to feel different, unusual, not strange in a dramatic sense, but subtle deviations that might surprise us today, because even within a world of balance, people still noticed details, and sometimes those details became admired. One example was the idea of a high forehead, not naturally in every case, but sometimes gently emphasized. Hair might be arranged in a way that revealed more of the upper face, creating a sense of openness, a kind of visual space that changed how the face was perceived. To us, this might feel unexpected, but within that time, it carried its own quiet appeal, not extreme, not exaggerated, just slightly different from what we might expect. There were also preferences for certain proportions, not mathematical, not measured precisely, but sensed. A face that felt elongated or softly structured could be perceived as refined, again, not universally, but often enough to form a pattern, And then there were moments where contrast itself became noticeable, a feature that stood out slightly, not enough to break harmony, but enough to add character, perhaps a sharper nose or a more defined jaw. Something that gave individuality without overwhelming balance, because even within harmony, there is room for uniqueness. In fact, it is often these small differences that make a person memorable, not perfection, but distinction, held gently within structure. There is also something else to consider, because what feels unusual to us may not have felt unusual then. It may have been perfectly normal, simply part of how beauty was understood within that specific time and place. And this reminds us of something important: beauty is not fixed, it changes quietly over time. What feels natural in one era may feel unfamiliar in another, and yet both exist with the same certainty. In their own context, there is something calming in this realization, because it removes the idea of a single correct image. It replaces it with variation, with movement, with quiet transformation across generations. Even within medieval life, these unusual ideals did not dominate. They remained subtle, small variations within a larger framework of balance, never overwhelming the whole, only adding to it. Like a quiet note in music, slightly different, but still part of the harmony. The world remains steady. A figure stands near a window, light falling across their face, revealing small details that make them distinct. Not striking, not perfect, but memorable in a quiet way. And perhaps that is where beauty becomes most human, not in perfection, but in variation. And as we move forward, we begin to turn inward, because after exploring all these external ideas, there is one question left: what happens when appearance meets identity, when the way one looks interacts with the way one feels within themselves? That is where things become more personal. By now, the world of medieval beauty feels familiar: the quiet balance, the subtle expectations, the gentle shaping of appearance. All of it has formed a kind of structure, a way of being seen, but beneath that structure, there was always something else, something less visible, something that could not be fully shaped by fabric, or posture, or careful presentation. Identity, not the identity that others observed, but the one that existed quietly within, because while people adjusted their appearance, while they aligned themselves with expectation, they were still individuals, with thoughts, with preferences, with moments of difference that did not always match the world around them. And this created a quiet contrast between how one appeared and how one felt, not always in conflict. Often they aligned. A person might feel comfortable within the expectations of their environment, their appearance, their behavior, their presence, all moving together naturally, and in those moments, there was ease, but not always. Sometimes there were small differences, subtle feelings that did not fully match the image presented to others, not dramatically, not enough to disrupt daily life, but enough to be noticed internally. A person might adjust their clothing, present themselves in a certain way, and yet feel slightly separate from it, as if the outer image was not entirely their own. There is something quiet about this experience, because it is rarely spoken, especially in a world where expectations are absorbed so naturally. There were no clear spaces for open reflection in the way we understand today, no language to fully describe the difference between internal identity and external presentation. And yet, the feeling existed, because it is human, a quiet awareness that who we are is not always identical to how we are seen. But within medieval life, this difference was often softened, not erased, but blended, because the world itself encouraged alignment. A shared structure, a shared rhythm, a shared understanding of appearance made it easier to move with expectation rather than against it, and for many, this brought comfort. A sense of belonging, a feeling of being part of something stable, but still, within that stability, individuality remained, not loudly expressed, not sharply defined, but present. in small preferences, in subtle ways of carrying oneself, in tiny variations that others might not even notice, and perhaps that is where personal identity lived most clearly, not in opposition to society, but within it, quietly shaping the details, while leaving the larger structure intact. There is something gentle about this balance, a coexistence between self and expectation. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to move through life, without constant conflict. The world remains still, a figure stands alone for a moment, no one watching, no need to adjust, and in that brief space, they are simply themselves, unobserved, unshaped, and then, as they step back into shared space, the layers return, not as a burden, but as part of living, and perhaps, this is the quiet truth beneath it all, that identity is never only internal, and never only external. It exists somewhere in between, always shifting, always adjusting, always balancing, and as we move toward the end of this journey, one final thought begins to form, because after everything we've seen, after all the expectations, all the subtle details, all the quiet pressures, there is still one question left. What does beauty really mean when all of this is stripped away? Now, after everything we've explored, all the quiet details, all the subtle expectations, all the ways appearance was shaped and understood, we arrive at something softer, not a conclusion, not an answer, but a reflection, because beauty, in medieval times, was never a single idea. It was layered, built from environment, from class, from habit, from perception, and from quiet observation of others. It existed in fabric, in hair, in posture, in scent, in presence, and even in silence. But when we step back and look at all of it together, something interesting appears. Most of what we've described was not enforced loudly, it was lived, absorbed slowly over time, through repetition and familiarity, and because of that, people rarely questioned it directly. It simply felt normal, but normal is always shaped by context. What feels natural in one time may feel unfamiliar in another, and what feels unusual today may have once been everyday reality. This is where perspective begins to shift, because beauty is not fixed in place, it moves quietly across generations, across cultures, across ways of seeing the human form, and within that movement, nothing remains absolute. Even the ideals we've explored were not universal. They shifted slightly, from place to place, from moment to moment, from one life to another, and so, what remains, not rules, not definitions, but patterns, soft patterns, that help us understand how people once saw each other, and perhaps, how they saw themselves, because beneath appearance, there was always something deeper, a desire to be understood, to be accepted, to belong within a shared world. Appearance became one way of expressing that, not the only way, but an important one. And now, from our perspective, looking back across time, we see not just beauty standards, but human effort, quiet effort, to exist within structure, while still remaining oneself. And as this thought settles, there is one final, gentle realization. Even today, though the details have changed, the same quiet questions remain. How much of what we present is shaped by the world around us, and how much is truly our own? The answer is not given here. It is left open, like a soft space, at the end of a long story, a place where thought can linger, without needing resolution. The world becomes quieter now. The images fade slowly, like aged paint losing its brightness over time, a medieval figure standing still, not performing, not adjusting, just existing within soft light, and then, slowly, even that begins to fade, leaving only silence. And perhaps, that is where reflection truly begins, not in what is shown, but in what remains, after everything else grows quiet.